Hello, hello, hello to everyone who is early and eager to join us for this webinar. Hello, everyone who was super excited to join us early and is jumping in. A artifact of webinars nowadays is we want to greet Katie's auto recorder. People sign up for webinars and send their auto recorder, which is always fascinating. Um, Thanks for coming early. We're going to give it a minute to start, and then I'm going to introduce my colleague, and he is going to wow you with more information about standardized testing for college admissions than you ever could imagine. As this fills up, just so everybody knows as you're waiting, let me answer two logistical questions. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send out the recording in the follow-up notes, as well as the presentation that Jed offers, the actual presentation itself. And I'll also send out some information if you want Applerouth's help on mock tests or that kind of stuff. Let me give it one more minute, and then we will go all in
And
to
Bob,
standardized
I'm going to
testing.
send you an updated copy. I made a
Great,
couple edits. There were some new releases about the ACT, so I added some new
great,
slides.
great.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple of people may join late, but I'm going to get us going. I'm Bob Carlton with College Matchpoint. Most of y'all know that because you either work with us or heard about us. You get to hear from probably the most skilled and strategic person on standardized testing and college admissions that you could hear from, and you're going to hear from him for free. He's Jed Applerouth. Not only is the founder of one of the most compelling test prep partners that we work with, but he also works with kids and he loves kids. He's an unrepentant test prep nerd, but first and foremost, he's a kid nerd. So he's going to look at this and take you through this from a student's point of view and a parent's point of view. I want to start by saying the reason that many of you joined this is because you've heard how stressful standardized testing could be in college admissions, and it can be not just taking the test, but figuring out which test and how to prep and when to prep and how colleges evaluate it. It's just stressful. And as Jed and I joked a couple of months ago, all we're doing is going through the next normal. There's no new normal of standardized testing. All the schools haven't gone back, but some of the schools are going back from test optional to test required. So I won't take any more of Jed's time because he's going to go deep into this. Please feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A. I'll try to answer those that I can. And Jed, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Bob, thank you so much. Great to be here. Let me share my screen and we'll start the deck. Slideshow from beginning. All right, so here we go. The topic is testing college admissions. And again, I'm going to cover a lot of material and we're going to for sure have time at the end. For question and answer. And so that is coming. All right, so let's jump in and dive into the content. To begin with, we live in a duopoly. We have an SAT, we have an ACT. They overlap roughly 80%. And there are some differences, and that's a reason kids take both tests to see, am I better on this one, better on that one? The ACT is a little bit higher in its level of math. It has a separate science section for now. And the SAT has a higher reading level, higher grade level. It's roughly an 11th grade reading level versus a ninth grade on the ACT. And also there are differences in timing, other things, but some of those differences are changing because there is a brand new, shorter, slower ACT in development that's going to be rolled out relatively soon. We'll talk about that in a few slides. So again, more advanced reading, SAT, more advanced math, and a separate science section, that's the ACT. That's the high level. So currently, we have this is the current structure. If I'm taking the SAT this month or the ACT next month, you have two sections for reading for verbal on the SAT, 10-minute break, and then two math sections, and they're adaptive. We'll talk about what that means. On the ACT, it's been the same four sections since 1959. They were trying to approximate the curriculum of the US. Everett Franklin Lindquist was a professor at Iowa, And he developed these, and they haven't really changed. And reading, English, take a break, math, science, then you're done. Some kids get this experimental section at the end to help pretest items. So right now, the ACT is, 35 or 41 minutes longer in administration. So that's been a liability for them. There is a strong preference for a short and sweet SAT. Kids tend to like it that it's short. They're done by 11 o'clock. They're out the door. That's great. The ACT takes longer. And so that's created some pressure for them to make a change. The pilot they administered in June of this year, they brought it from 255 down to 205. They beat the SAT at their own game. And one of the ways they did that, the primary way, they reduced the number of items on the reading, English, and math section, and they pushed science to the end and made it optional. After next after September of next year, they are going to cease giving out a composite score that contains science. The new composite score for the ACT is going to be reading, English, and math only, and then you'll have a separate optional science score. The scale will be the same, 1 to 36, but the new average will include reading, English, and math, and this will skew more towards the verbal skills. That's one change that if you were, more of a STEM kid, your composite score blended math and science to counter the reading English, but now it'll skew more towards verbal, whatever, how that might change based on your performance. But your science score can still be there, but we think that once things go optional, they tend to linger along, but they tend to reduce and at some point go away. Like the optional writing assessment that was part of the SAT has now been cut off and it's gone. There still is an optional writing on the ACT, but that's taken by a small number of people, mostly internationals trying to prove their English skills, and for some states and districts who require it to measure performance on that skill from the schools within the district or the state. All right, so the digital SAT, it's a digital sectional adaptive test. On the computer, it's using the Blue Book app, which any kid who's taken the PSAT has now seen the Blue Book app. We've been administering these since March of last year and also a year before that internationally. So we now have, like 8+ tests. This thing works and kids tend to like it. The way it works, they give you, when you walk in the door, there'll be a baseline verbal section. If I get roughly 2/3 of the items right, I get pushed to a more advanced, harder adaptive module. If I get below 2/3, that's the threshold, I'm going to an easier module. And then 10-minute break, I go and sit down and take a baseline math, which has a smattering of easy, medium, hard questions. I get 2/3 right, I'm going hard math for my adaptive. Below 2/3 right, I'm going easy. That's the whole notion of what a sectional test is. That's adaptive. Very different than item adaptive, where every item keeps changing. That's like the GMAT. All right, so historically, you have a lot more time per question on the SAT. That's something, and this has been, I guess, exacerbated by, by the changes to the SAT. When they made it digital and domestically back in March, they gave kids a lot more time per question. And so that's when they really pushed. On the verbal section, the SAT has 70% more time per question compared to the ACT. That's tremendous and really a big deal. Most kids finish the verbal section on the SAT. The math, additionally, you have an extra 35 seconds per question, which is very meaningful. Though kids going to the hard module will need some of that time because we're seeing, since the March test, more multi-level problems showing up on the SAT that require more creativity, more problem solving. It's not so direct. You have to do maybe 2 or 3 or even 4 different functions to get the answer. So some of these questions do take more time. They aren't necessarily crazy hard, but they're just more time intensive. And so some of the kids will need that time. However, on the pilot, we have this change. So now we're going from 70 to 59. So verbal is going down to 36% more time on the SAT and 40% more time on math. So the digital SAT verbal, you have 71 seconds per question. On the ACT, now you have over 50 seconds per question. Same thing with math. They gave you an extra 7 more seconds. So the timing differential is becoming less pronounced. That's meaningful. Now, the number of items on the test, when the digital SAT came out in this adaptive module, one of the beautiful things about adaptive testing is you can ask fewer items and arrive at the exact same answer. So currently on the ACT, which is non-adaptive, for the verbal section, reading plus English, you have 115 items to generate your verbal score. Compare that to the adaptive SAT, where they only need 54 items to give you the exact same score. So that's profound. That's one of the beauties of adaptive testing. When I go adaptive, I can eliminate plenty of items that are not really indicative of a student's performance. If a student's really, really advanced, I can lop off a bunch of easy items. If a student is a lower level student, I can eliminate a bunch of the really hard items because typically kids at a lower level wouldn't get those right, even if they guess randomly on some. So that's one thing. But the new test, what they're doing, they're not going adaptive, but they are just tightening up. They've been doing some studies on reliability and validity, and they found that, you know what? We had some extraneous items in there. We didn't actually need 115 items because there've always been more items on the SAT. Can we cut them down and maintain reliability and validity? Yes, we can. So the new test, they just lopped off some, 40 items or so. So now we have 86 items to get to the same score. It's not adaptive, but it is shorter, and that's beneficial. So we're going from 215 total items on the current ACT down to 131 between the verbal and math. And then science is at the end, and science is optional. And I do think that science will be fading away over time. Okay. So content-wise, you have a lot more algebra and advanced math on the SAT. You have more geometry, more trigonometry on the ACT. And there's slightly more data analysis, tables, charts, stats on the ACT. So there are some differences. But again, the big takeaway here is a ton of algebra, algebra 1, algebra 2, function notation, graphing. That's the lion's share of content on the SAT. So here's the format. For the SAT, you have these two modules for reading and writing that are each 32 minutes. You have two modules on math, 35 minutes, 10-minute break in the middle. The total testing time is only 2 hours and 14 minutes, and then 10-minute break. So it's a really short test, which is very nice. You also have experimental items. There are 8 experimental items per test, which are used for pre-testing, also called anchoring items, making sure there's no bias in questions by gender, by geography, by ethnicity, and also making sure they have the right level of difficulty. They can help measure and gauge, is it a level 5 really hard problem or a level 1 really easy problem? Make sure they know they build a test with the right level of difficulty. So again, I mentioned this before, baseline, 2/3 right, I'm going harder, below 2/3 right, I'm going easier. That's how this works. Everything takes place in this app called the Blue Book app. If you're curious about this, you can go online, download the Blue Book app right now and Google it. And then they have 6 practice tests currently for the SAT that you can play with and totally free, College Board tool. Additionally, one of the nice things about digital testing, they have all these fun things. They have a little timer. You can hide or show a reference sheet. You can show or hide. You can annotate and highlight things. You can enter your own notes. You can mask the answers and not see them in advance. Also, you can magnify things if you need some help with that. Here's just a little screen grab of what this thing looks like. So when you open the Blue Book app, and one of the nice things is on the Blue Book app, most kids are going to be taking these tests on their own device, their own laptop, their own MacBook, their own tablet. Sometimes it's a school provided, it could be a Chromebook. But so what you practice on is the exact same device that you'll be taking the test on. That's pretty cool. 3 days in advance, typically of the administration, you download the test, it's encrypted. You go into the test center on Saturday morning or during a school day test, you enter the code, it's unencrypted, you can see it, you can start it, and everything is saved to the device. And you only need Wi-Fi for a few seconds at the beginning to download your code and unlock the encryption. And you only need Wi-Fi for a few seconds at the very end to upload the answers. Otherwise, everything takes place on your app. Even if you lose power, it's all being saved and time-stamped with every keystroke. Very smart system, good user interface, good user experience. Now the math section goes easy to hard. And one of the key differences that on the digital SAT, the Desmos calculator is a huge, huge deal. I can't overemphasize that if you want to do your very best on this new digital SAT, you want to practice with Desmos. About half the kids in the US use Desmos in some form currently through their high school. Desmos licenses and sells to high schools all over the country. And they use it for physics, for graphing. They're using a pared down version on the SAT because you don't need all the full strength and functions available from a full scientific Desmos calculator. It really is like the graphing functions. You also have scratch paper. You can ask for more, raise your hand, beyond the 3 sheets that are given to you when you walk in. So here on the math section, if I click on that calculator link, Desmos opens up, and then reference, it opens up the formulas for circles and right triangles and Pythagorean theorem and so forth. So that's how this works. And Desmos can help you with a lot of algebra. Just giving you one example. And here is Desmos. That's all it is. So you have the basic functions. And one of the nice things is your TI-80 calculator, the one we used back in high school, you have to enter everything in the form of y equals mx plus b. Not here at all. I can do anything x squared plus y squared equals, 225c plus, ab squared. You enter it and you're typing it in. It's very nice, not entering a little calculator. It's very quick, very efficient. And you can enter multiple graphs in, and they can graph like 5 things simultaneously. And you can then work the graph and back points out. Very, very fun. Here's an example. Basic equation systems. We have 2 lines, the XY format, and they're asking you that a solution is x comma y. What's the value of the y variable? So to solve for y, I could, plug in, multiply the top times -9, bottom times 6. I could get rid of my x's, leave the y's, and y equals blank. Or I could just enter those things very quickly. 6x plus 10y equals 60. Boom. Then that line is drawn. Line x minus 5y equals 30. Boom, that line is drawn. I hover over the intercept, and the x value is 5, the y value is 3. I'm done. So you just saved about 30 seconds. And over the period of a test, doing this several times can really help you move more quickly and have more time for the really hard stuff. So Desmos is your friend. And that's something that I want to make sure I sell that pretty hard, because it's important. In our book on how to master the SAT, we have a whole section dedicated to how to use Desmos. But you can go for free to desmos.com, log in, play around, practice. Also, Khan Academy has some free applications and free use, but definitely work on that. So in brief, just so you understand the structure, here's an example of on the Blue Book test, Math 1 looks like this. Here's the curve. You have 2 level 1 questions, 10 level 2, 7 level 3, and 3 level 4. So it's mostly middle content. You have a couple easy ones, 3 hard ones. Mostly you're in the middle section. If I get below 2/3 right, not so strong in this section, they're going to give me a lot more easy questions. Now things skew really heavily towards easy. The 7 level 1s, very easy. 9 level 2s, down to 5 level 3s, and only 1 level 4. So it's still, there's a recipe with a combination of 1, 2, 3s, and 4s, but now I'm skewing towards easy. If, however, I go to the hard section, it looks like this. I don't have 7 level 1s, I have 1. I don't have 9 level 2s, I have 4. But now I'm answering 12 level 3s and 5 level 4s, so I'm skewing to the right. And so it turns out that this actually is a little bit easier. The hard module is in fact harder than this when it comes to what kids have been seeing March, May, June, and then August is coming. So how do you prep? Work in the Blue Book. Be mindful that the math section on test 1, 2, and 3 is too easy. And I think in time, what they're going to do is either correct that, recalibrate it, or eliminate those early tests and add in some properly calibrated tests. Because kids who were prepping on tests 1, 2, and 3 and then took March, they were like, what is this? This is so much harder. And that's right. But then they added within 2 weeks of that March administration 2 more tests, test 5 and 6, which are much better calibrated. So test 4, 5, and 6 are more accurate for that advanced math section. And so that's it. Then when they give you the scores back, they're being a lot more opaque. One of the differences in scoring on this new digital adaptive test is that every item doesn't count the same. That was the protocol for about 95 years when this thing, 1926, they administered the first SAT, and every item counted 1 point. Not anymore. Now there's something called item response scoring, where the scoring is algorithmic. They actually analyze the performance of the total cohort, and they assign weights and values to those items. They actually back it out. They can do it instantly because there's no more mailing tests and scantrons. When the tests are all done that afternoon, data's all in, they can analyze it instantly. Very, very impressive, quick stuff. So then they say, you know what? Test item number 14 is actually really, really important. We're going to count this 3 times more than item 13. And it has, fundamental things. If kids know this item, then they really understand the foundations of functions or algebra, whatever it is. So different items count different weights. Because of that, because of that, and also what that means is a student could get 12 right and do a lot better than a kid who gets 15 right. And kids are like, wait a minute, what? So what they do, they don't give you back the number right or wrong anymore. They give you these heat maps. They also don't tell you you missed number 13, you missed number 19. They also never tell you if you went to the hard module or the easy module. The only way you know that is by your test score. If I go to the easy module, I'm capped out around a 660, and I really can't get any higher than that. So if I got a 680 or 670 or higher, I know I went to the hard module. However, there is a place of overlap where you don't know. If I get a 550, I could have went to the hard module and done so-so, or I could have went to the easy module and done pretty well. And so that overlap range, it's around from 440 to around 650. I can't tell if I went easy or hard. Below 440, I went to the easy module. Because if I get to the hard module, I'm guaranteed I've locked in 440 points, even if I get everything wrong on the adaptive module. So, but again, they don't tell you which module. You shouldn't worry so much about which module. But kids who are used to this test realize if they're seeing a bunch of hard questions pretty early on the adaptive module, they're probably in the hard section. And if there really aren't that many hard problems at all, you're probably in the easy section. And some kids can help get that calibration with some practice content. But again, this is all they give you. And I show you this because it's important, like, the practice tests from companies like Applerouth and other places give you the full detail. You missed number 1, you missed number 7, you missed 18. Here's why you missed it. Otherwise, score return looks like this. And it's much less granular and much less useful for a tutor or a student trying to improve their score. I mentioned before that the March test looked more like this, and subsequent tests, March, May, and June, look more like this. We have a lot more hard problems. They don't give you 5 level 4 difficulties, they might give you 10. And so we're seeing a skew towards the really tough content, and even more so than what you saw on the early tests in the Blue Book app. Now, the ACT is changing. This news came out about a month ago. Not so surprised, because again, they did a pilot in June, and then they announced in July that, yep, the pilot worked, and we're going to take it and run with it. So we're going to see this shorter test starting in April in available markets. It's going to come to paper in September of a year from now. So if you are a junior, you're going to see it September of senior year in paper format. Everything going forward beyond that test. So when you're a senior, they'll all be the shorter version with optional science. Here is the structure that we saw the pilot in June. We went from 75 questions down to 50 on English. We dropped 15 questions in math. We dropped 4 questions in reading and 0 in science. So we're going towards more around a 40, 45, 50. That's kind of the range, versus before they had 60 for math and 75 for English. So we're knocking down 39 plus 15, 54 items we're knocking down. That's very, very helpful. All right, so we're 44. So the ACT also is giving kids more time. Time increase, it's 70% more time on English, 11% for math, reading pops 27%, science pops 29%. So globally, you have 100% more time on the new adaptive test, on the new digital test. Science, again, is optional. Some kids will want to showcase their science skills. It's not as much science as like an AP exam or chemistry or physics. And there was a time that Georgia Tech, where I live in Atlanta, they didn't even count the science section for a time. They wanted your reading skill and your math skill, because math is more predictive of performance in college than the science. Science really is a combination of reading skills and graph skills with a little bit. 7 of the 40 questions require some kind of outside knowledge about science, but it's nothing like taking bio or chem or physics. It's more about, do you understand the foundational structure of science? What's a hypothesis? What is, if there's error in the measurement, what is sampling error? That kind of stuff. What's a dependent variable? Looking at the structure of science, and not so much the grand detail of it all. So here is the rollout. This was released, I think it was 2 days ago. So April, that's going to be digital ACTs only. The challenge, though, becomes access. Because I just logged in. I'm writing an article about this for our newsletter on Tuesday, and I was curious how far would I have to go to get a digital test right now in Atlanta? So I looked at the nearest 10 centers. There's one 12 miles away, but the average distance for me to go to get a digital test on those 10 centers is 48 miles. So I have to go 48 miles on average to find a test center near my house. And this is before there's any real demand for this. Versus a paper-based test in Atlanta. There's a test center 2 miles away from me, and the average of the nearest 10 centers is actually around 8 miles from my house. I can go in a bunch of different directions to find a test. So once there's actual real demand for this, kids might be driving 3, 4 hours to find a test, so availability is going to be a real constraint. So even though if kids want to take the April short test with science optional, many of them will not be able to unless they can lock down more contracts. I think most people are going to have to wait until September of next year when these changes go to paper-based testing, as well as digital and international testing. In September of next year, that's when the composite changes and science gets bumped out. It'll be a separate section, a standalone. And then spring of 2026, that's when these changes are going to be coming to state and district and school-based local testing during a school day, not during national test date on a weekend. So we'll see what happens. One of my colleagues and friends in the industry thinks there is a chance, there's a world where by September, if demand shifts, they're just going to throw away all of paper testing and move digital like the College Board has with the SAT. It's simpler, it's cleaner, there's less of a chance for fraud or cheating or errors. And it makes things cleaner, honestly, having paper gone. So we'll see. And Janet Godwin, current CEO of the ACT, said that, preserving paper was market driven. And the bank quote is this: as soon as demand for the paper test dries up, we're going fully digital. And so that to me is interesting. And we're going to find out how soon that happens. I think the main thing that has to happen is they've got to figure out a way for kids to bring their own devices in. Because right now, the massive constraint is you are reliant upon the testing center to provide all the infrastructure, to provide all the computers, all the tablets, which really puts a strain and a burden because not all schools have, rooms and rooms full of computers. It's so much easier when the kid walks in with their laptop or their tablet, like for the College Board, for the SAT and the PSAT. So we'll see. Hopefully, and this actually has been a problem internationally where a lot of kids can't get testing because there were many, many more test centers internationally in 2018 before they required everyone to go digital and they got rid of paper. And so that's been driving a lot of the international market away from the ACT to the SAT. And so we'll see what happens in the US. Concordance may not be a big problem. Dropping science will matter. Will colleges accept these changes? I bet they will. Will that make the ACT more competitive versus the ST? I bet it will. All right, here is the calendar. As it stands, you have 7 ACTs and you have 7 SATs. Again, starting in April, some lucky students will be able to take the short ACT in digital form, but we don't know how broadly that'll be available. I think it really will be a matter of luck and lottery, kids who log in early to get their spots. But it'll become widespread a year from next month. Ideally, as you're building your testing plan on having 3 administrations, 3 official tests. Some kids need 1, some kids need 2, but we see steady gains through the 3rd test. The big jump happens 1 to 2, then you have a marginal gain from 2 to 3. Could be on 1 section or 2 sections, but ideally, you have that in your plan. And but if you're 1 and done, lovely, but have 3 in your testing, have 3 arrows in your quiver. That's helpful. So now we're going to talk about the broader testing landscape, what's happening with testing. And as Bob mentioned, we're seeing a slow but meaningful comeback of testing. The pandemic, every school in the country was test optional because kids couldn't take tests. And then you had no option. Before that, almost all of the schools that were very selective were test required. Chicago popped out in 2018, and there were a few other ones, but almost all the big ones, all the big names they were test required. Georgia went back pretty quickly. Florida never dropped it. Florida has all their scholarships tied to testing, and so they never went test optional. That was one of the few. So I say all the schools in the country, there were a few who didn't. And Florida is one of those systems. Georgia brought it back within a year of the year and a half of the pandemic. Georgetown brought it back. They love testing, right back. MIT brought it back in 2022. Tennessee, the flagships and the whole state system came back. Then Purdue. Then we had this drought for over a year. And then boom, this spring, it was like popcorn. It was like candy for the testing industry, where first Dartmouth came out and said, we're going back. Sean Baylock, researcher, someone I respect highly, is the president of Dartmouth, said, we saw the research, the evidence, we're going back. Testing is actually meaningful and is predictive. Why would we not use it? Then Yale jumped on within a week, and Brown came in a week or so later. UT Austin, where you all live, they jumped in and said, yep, the data is clear. Test scores give us information independent of high school GPA. Then within a few weeks, Harvard, Caltech the same day, then Cornell within a couple of weeks, and Stanford. And I'm anticipating we're going to see many more coming back, midway through the fall, or at least after apps are in December, January. So there are definitely more. There are plenty of schools who are still contemplating the change, who are waiting for more data. We haven't had 4 full years of test optional, but as they're running the analyses, they're seeing, kids who have test scores, there are differences in performance for, especially at schools that are very selective. Look at that. So here's kind of some of the big brands, and there are more coming. This is going to be a much fuller list in about a year. So the rationale, Stuart Schmell at MIT said, you know what? We can't tell who will do well at MIT without test scores, because a lot of kids have A's, they come here, and a lot of kids with A's fail out. So having an A in calculus isn't enough. Having a 5 in calculus on the AP is meaningful, or giving us a 790 on math. Otherwise, I can't tell if you're ready for them working at MIT. Same thing, Christina Paxson over at Brown. Yep, test scores are a better picture of performance at Brown than your grades. Jeremiah Quinlan, bingo, same thing. Test scores are more important than grades. And then Dartmouth, same thing. And then Jay Herzl over at UT, that test submitters had higher grades and were less likely to be on probation academically. So this is probably the most important slide driving the return to test required. When you look at the left side, this was some of the research that was, carried out by, the Ivies plus the 4 schools, Ivies plus the 12 schools in the research of Opportunity Insights, that as my test score goes up, my GPA in college is at a linear lockstep. It's a strong relationship. Look at the correlation, however, between high school GPA and college GPA, not nearly as strong. Kids applying to college with a 3.1 high school GPA, they're averaging around a 3.45 in college. Kids applying with a 4.0 are only getting a mere 3.5 and change. So that's 0.1 of grade point difference. It's so minimal. So we're saying we're not getting much from high school grades, whereas testing really tells us who will be really strong. That's a very compelling slide. And then again, Jay Herzl, I mentioned that looking at the 9,000 kids who submitted test scores, they were much more likely to be above a 2.0. Kids without test scores were going to be on probation at a much higher rate. And the same thing at mid-year, those with test scores had almost a full grade point higher, 0.86 of grade point, even after controlling for high school grades and class ranks. So kids with test scores were doing better at UT. Right now, the map looks like this. Where do we have? And expect more state schools to fill in the South, especially. There's talk about a big Southern block coming back: Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana. I'm waiting week by week for UNC Chapel Hill to come back to test return. They, like other flagships, Texas, out of state, their admit rate is 8%. It's crazy. UNC is about 6%. Also, Chapel Hill is nuts. And so they get so many kids who have, really strong grades, they need a differentiator. And about 7 in 10 kids who apply and are enrolled at UNC have a test score. So I'm just waiting for them to go back, because that's the kind of profile, the very selective state school, that I think testing makes the most sense. And the Board of Regents passed something this summer, I think it was in May or June, allowing individual schools to make their own decision. I think Chapel Hill will come back probably in the fall or the winter. Other schools who are test optional still are giving you hints about how much they care about testing. Grinnell says, hey, if your score is above average for Grinnell, something that may help you. If you don't submit it, we have less information about you. Boston College, They said, testing provides measurable value in predicting academic success. For this reason, students who complete the test are encouraged to submit the scores. So they're test optional, but test encouraged. And there are many schools who have that kind of language on their websites. There's a thing,
Jed,
yes,
Jed, a quick question. A couple of slides back, you had asterisks next to Cornell and Stanford on the testing slide. What's the background on Cornell and Stanford?
they pushed a year. They announced so late in the season that like Stanford announced in June. And so again, kids are going to be applying early ED to Stanford in October. So or November 1st. So they felt that it would be unfair to switch it for this calendar year. And so they're giving kids a year of grace.
Great.
So for rising seniors, they can still apply test optional. Rising juniors, test scores are required. So they just gave a year of grace because they announced so late. Okay.
Great. Thanks.
Sure, of course. Test flexible. That is you can opt out given a certain threshold in grades, or you can submit other tests in lieu of the SAT or ACT. The one prominent example of conditional is going to be Auburn. Their test preferred. That's their language. We encourage them. This language is interesting. They're not required. Applicants with at least a 3.6 who cannot secure a test will be considered for admission under our test optional pathway. And now it's like, who can't secure a test? Kids in California, maybe. Kids in Washington State. Some of them are driving and flying, driving 3 hours, flying to Idaho, because the availability for tests in California is pitiful. And it's a real problem for the College Board and the ACT. Because a lot of high schools just are closing their doors. They're doing testing for their own kids, but not making it available for others. And so it's really a challenge for some of our students. So, and also Yale is now flexible. They are test required, but you can choose your flavor. You can choose to submit the ACT or the SAT or every single one of your AP scores, every single one of your IB scores. You can't withhold them. If you get a 3 on BC Calc, it goes in the mix. It's being sent. You can't just send your 4s and 5s. And Yale, when they announced this, Jeremiah Quinlan said part of the rationale for the flexible policy was that California kids were having a hard time testing. So they were aware of that California is just kind of weird. And one of the reasons why a lot of schools drop testing is because the UC system and the Cal State system are test blind. And so there are some kids some schools where everyone's going to be going to UC Riverside or Irvine or Cal State. But then how about those kids who want to go big? Then they can't get testing. That's why they made this policy. There's a question parents almost always ask is how much do these test scores matter? Is there an advantage? Is it real? Boston College is one place where the advantage is profound. And they've since changed their data from test optional to encouraged, where you see 70,000 people applied with tests and 5,000 got in. 23,000 people applied without tests and only 2,000 got in. So the acceptance rate is almost 3x. So test scores matter, and they want test scores. And they said test scores provide measurable value. For this reason, if you finish them, you're encouraged to submit them. And so that's it. Here is some data. Yale, when they made their announcement and changed over from test optional to required, they released that we'd been test optional for 3 years, but it turns out kids with test scores were getting in at 3 times the rate of those without. And that was surprising because no one knew that until they made the announcement. Boston College, there's a big advantage at Tech, Colgate, Notre Dame, Emory, UVA, and many others. At some schools like Vandy, their admissions office doesn't have the same level of preference. But clearly, there is some advantage here. And
Can I
yes,
told Jed that I would try to be the Snoop Dogg on this webinar, not the gymnastics partner. But if you can go back a slide, from a college planning standpoint, if there's one thing you take away from this, it's that there's test optional and there's test optional asterisk. And by test optional asterisk, we mean, yeah, it's test optional, but a student disproportionately is advantaged if she submits strong test scores. And if there's one thing, and I've told Jed this in many of our conversations, that we're seeing across the board with students, different this year than last year from the admitted class, is that standardized test scores oftentimes were significant, not determinant, but significant at many, many schools. Sorry, Jed.
Perfect. No, thank you, Bob. Appreciate that. And that's absolutely right. And part of what's interesting is schools don't publish this data. We were able to cobble this together and sometimes calculate it using like three different press releases, trying to tease out things because it's not captured by the common data set. It's not captured on their websites. And honestly, most schools stopped giving us this data. This happened for a year or two. They're publishing it during the pandemic. Since then, people are being mum because they really want everyone to apply. And if kids knew that they were at a massive disadvantage, they might lose some applications. And so they're trying to cast a broad net. So they're being hush about this. But from their early transparency, we know that, wow. And when Yale said we're giving up the ghost, there was a big difference. That was never on their website. That was never being broadcast. So it's interesting, things you don't know. When you don't have that data, what you could do, the common data set captures this very cleanly. The percent of students submitting the SAT and the ACT also, Bob mentioned that two of our colleagues, they maintain a database of this information, which is very helpful. It's on the common data set, but it's nice to have it aggregated. And in Princeton, they're just optional. 85% of the students who are enrolled at Princeton submitted test scores. So yeah, it's optional, but man, if I'm applying to Princeton, I want a test score. And that 15%, that's probably students who are first generation and their families, their certain circumstances. Maybe these are the athletes, something special about them. These aren't the straight academic kid, typically. UNC, I mentioned, is 81% test submission, which is why not make it required? Obviously, this matters to you. UVA, Chicago, Penn, Emory, and so forth. So, and I wouldn't be surprised in the least if all these schools come back to test required. We'll see what happens. Chicago might stay optional, but they made some comments about that in the last year or two. We'll see what happens with that. Jeremiah Quinlan over at Yale, he broke for transparency and honesty. And he said, yep, the rate of admissions, it's been 6 with scores, 2 without. Over time, I became more and more convinced that we were not being honest. Thank you, Jeremiah, about the reality of our process. We were missing important data. Here we go. Students who did not submit test scores were inadvertently hurting their chances at it. So that's why they said we can't keep living the lie and we're coming clean and tests are now required. So I feel like there are other schools in the same boat who haven't made these announcements, but we just don't know what's happening behind closed doors. They're opaque about that. All right, a few slides on the APs, and then we're going to shift to Q&A. There was some news recently. They're recalibrating certain APs, getting a little bit easier to pass. They're recalibrating AP English and Language, and AP English Language, English Literature. Here's one example. I pulled this. This is from John Beckenstadt, colleague, friend. I wouldn't say friend, colleague, who I've seen him many times present at conferences. And the number of 4s just popped dramatically this year. The number of 3s is up. And look at the number of 1s. It went from 30% of kids got a 1 on a push. That dropped down to about 7%. So they're gutting the 1s and giving kids a lot more 3s and 4s. So there are some changes now as they're recalibrating some of these tests, which you might call it AP inflation, whatever you call it. But and some professors, some teachers, a push like Mark Rundell said, hey, 3/4 of my kids passed with 3s and 4s and 5s. Typical years, I was below half. So that was an eye opener. So there are some changes happening. So getting a 3 or 4 on a push is less impressive than it was 2 years ago. There is a change taking place this May. This May, where the College Board is getting more bang for the buck out of their Blue Book app, and they're turning these I think 9 tests onto digital. Paper goes away for Comp Sci, English Language, English Lit, European, Psych, Seminar, US, A-Push, and then Modern World History. So 2.4 million kids in African American Studies, they're going to be offered only in computer-based form. All you do is bring your laptop, your computer, your tablet, and typing. It's going to be mostly typing. And then a year from this May, we're going to roll this out to our history, Comp Pol and Government, Comp Sci, Human Geography, and then U.S. Government and Politics. So that's going to be about 3 million of these tests are going to be only on the computer. They're still trying to sort how do we do it for like calculus and physics, where a lot of the credit comes from you showing your work and drawing things out and drawing diagrams. They'll sort it eventually, but right now they're doing the very easy ones where it's mostly answering A, B, C, D, or just typing out paragraphs and things. All right, on the format, the book app. You can practice, and then everything else is the same. Same number of questions, same timing, same schedule. You can move within a section. So it really is no big change except for they're going to have you take it on your device. All right, actually 7:45. So I allowed 15 minutes of questions. Why don't we shift over and
We
yeah.
we've got a great set of questions. So let me start with one of the more technical ones, and then we'll go through the rest. Different colleges within a school like Cornell have different testing policies. Do you think that will continue, Jed?
So Cornell, when their announcement, there were three schools that were test blind, score free, and that died. So as of, for this year, there's still a period of grace. At the end of this year, test required for every single student. And that was interesting. That was interesting because both Caltech and Cornell shifted from test blind, test free, score free to test required. That's a pretty aggressive move. But they did their analysis, they did their research, and it turns out, yeah, this it turns out test scores are very, predictive of performance at Cornell for all students. Therefore, they're back to required.
Next question, Jed. You've talked before about standardized tests in a world of grade inflation.
Yep.
And can you talk about, for the parents on this Zoom, why you're seeing colleges shifting more to standardized tests in a world of grade inflation?
So the problem with grade inflation and grade compression, we're seeing, grades aren't remotely, having A's is much less special than it was when everyone on this webinar, we were in high school in the 80s and 90s. Things, getting an A meant more than back then than it does today. And so we're seeing this slow creep up. And what it means is it's much harder to predict performance in college given grades. When everyone's getting A's and B's, and honestly, people just aren't giving C's. C's are a very rare grade now in high school compared to what they were 30, 40 years ago when they were more, the average grade used to be like a B. And now for many, many high schools, the average grade's an A. And so an A is an average grade. It's just hard to, like, what do I do with that? That puts more pressure on rigor. That's driving more kids to take more APs, more IBs, more dual enrollment classes to differentiate themselves. And also it's pushing colleges to say we need something more because everyone has A's. I gave a talk with the admissions officer over at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and she was saying for kids applying to tech out of state, 74% of students had exclusively A's. Not a single B in the transcript. People who applied, absolutely amazing. I'm actually the ones who actually got in. So, 3/4 of kids who were accepted didn't have a single B in high school from out of state, and then within the state of Georgia, that number was like 56% thereabouts. And so it's like, holy cow! It used to be having all A's was really special. That tells you having all A's makes you kind of average. So it's like when having all A's makes you, you're a good applicant. But the question she asked is, well, what kind of A's and in what classes? Having A's, parents come to her and say, my kid has all A's, or like, get in line. Because grading cultures have changed. And so to find a way to differentiate students, if they're scoring rigor more highly, and they're also looking at anything standardized. Standardized, they're putting more weight on AP scores, putting more weight on testing. And one thing also interesting, if you don't submit test scores for the SAT or the ACT, many admissions officers are saying we are looking with greater scrutiny on your AP scores or your IB scores. We need something standardized because so many kids have really robust inflated GPAs because people stop failing kids. There's all this extra credit. You talk to your kids. I work with students directly, and I'm just amazed. The kids can retake a test 3 times. They keep getting more points. So there's quality points, extra credit. There's more at-home testing, where it's like before and there's no, and there are certain teachers where if you fail, you get a 50 and not a 0. So they're trying to not have you get too penalized. So I tank a test. My lowest possible grade's a 50, which then of course kids aren't failing, and they're passing kids. We're minting more high school graduates, but we're also minting more high school graduates with lower levels of skill because we're kind of passing them along without doing the real heavy lifting with them. Sometimes failing a kid actually is the right thing to do, but there's pressure not to fail kids for a lot of reasons, politically and
Uh,
otherwise, financially. So
Next,
yeah, that's part of it.
next question, Jed. We have a couple of parents on the Zoom whose student has an IEP or has received accommodations for either the SAT or the ACT. What are the early trends you're seeing from the digital SAT as it relates to kids who have learning differences?
So our experience, we work with many, many, many kids with LDs, and we have been doing this test for over a year, about a year and a half internationally, and 4 administrations domestically. So the experience is students with learning differences typically like the new test for a lot of reasons. One of the best parts of it is kids have more time per question across the board. And the majority of kids who had issues with reading or dyslexia, dyscalculia, other things, processing speed issues, having more time solves it. And so with or without accommodations, having more time helps these kids. You also, we're going from these long, long form reading passages down to short 1 paragraph, one hitters. So it makes, you don't have to hold so much in working memory. And I can just focus on my little, 150 lines of text and then answer the question. You have a calculator on every single math question, which before was an accommodation, helps our math kids. And it's a short test. There are kids who have a challenge with focus and attention for ADHD kids, especially. So having to focus for 5 hours is tough, but a 2 hour, 20-minute test, a lot easier. So mental endurance reduced, processing speed reduced, working memory requirements reduced, calculator use, guaranteed. It's just like, and also your accommodations are built in, that you're not relying upon a proctor or even a reader. Some kids have screen to text if they have dyslexia or things like that. You have now a mic and you bring your own earpiece, and I can replay a thing myself. And also, I'm not waiting for someone to call time. Timer is right there. Once I start my test, my extra time is built in. My extra breaks are built in. I don't have to ask anybody. I just press take a break, I walk away, come back. So I think this test is actually great for kids with learning differences.
Next question. Uh, Given the changes with the SAT in the digital, does it still make sense for students to take a practice ACT and compare it to their PSAT, or do you think that advice has changed given the shift to digital?
I still like the ACT for a lot of kids. And again, like 2/3 of kids, they do about the same on the SAT versus the ACT. They're within the margin of error, which is around 60 points. You have 30 points of error on each test, that error of measurement. But beyond that range, sometimes I give a kid a PSAT or SAT and they get a 1200. And then I give them cold, an ACT, and they get a 29. It's like, whoa, you are better on the ACT. That's the equivalent of a 1290 beyond the margin of error. And so, and you don't know until you give a kid the test. Because some kids, again, the difference is the primary differences are the ACT. It is speedier, but there are kids who are fast. It's a much lower level of reading, which trips up some kids having like the really advanced text and hard reading on the SAT. The math is more advanced, but some kids are okay with the way they present math on the ACT. And so, honestly, and they may be better on geometry and trigonometry, but there's a lot more of that on the ACT, not as good as all the algebra on the SAT. So what I say is don't try to figure out, tease out, is my kid better on this one or this one using some kind of mental skills. Just give them a practice test. And soon it'll be very simplified. We're going to have just, a short ACT and a short SAT. But for right now, I still believe in giving a kid a practice test just to find out, are they one of those 1/3 of the kids, or they're better on one or the other?
Next question. With the schools that are shifting back to requiring test scores, what should we expect or assume will be the M for a school?
I'm
What?
sorry, I pressed
Yeah,
the.
don't worry. What are we thinking the test score range might look like for schools that are going back to requiring test scores?
When you revert back to test required, your score ranges drop. Typically. And the reason is this, except for I don't think they'll drop at Yale because one of the things I learned at Yale, like, you know what? We've been test optional for since the pandemic, and we had 50,000 more kids apply every year, but it didn't change who we enrolled. because the kids who were applying all this extra overage, they were kids who were below profile domestically, and they were a bunch of international kids who were happy about dropping the test requirement. But we omitted, honestly, classes that looked exactly the same. So I think for them, um, it won't change very much. But other schools like Georgia, that was an experiment. The year they went test required, I'm sorry, the year during the pandemic, they went test optional. The bottom third of kids didn't submit their test scores. Kids are smart. If your test scores aren't competitive in that middle 50 range or so, kids don't send them. And so you lop off about a quarter or third of your testers. Therefore, your test scores shift up. And certain schools it really, really popped when kids really dropped off. Georgia popped like 100 points on average, but then when they went test required, it came back, but it didn't go back as far. It came back like 70, 80. It was still higher than in 2019, but it didn't go, nowhere near where it was when it was test optional. Because kid, you're canceling out that lower quarter, thirds. At some schools, even half, where half the kids don't send test scores, and so that can really pop it. I think at University of Vermont, it went up like 100 points, 120 points. Like there's certain ones that really jumped up. So I'd expect the ranges to move back. So what I would say is I would type in the word common data set, and you can go back to 2019 or 2020 for the schools to which you're interested. And that'll give you a sense of where things were before they lopped off the bottom quarter of test scores. Just give you a sense of the actual range where they used to be. Because typically they're pretty, some schools are getting better over time, but it's a pretty slow rise versus the pandemic. And then boom, they just jump like 70 points. That's artificial. That's not a natural growth in the quality of the cohort.
And then last question. When a student is taking Algebra 2 as a junior, when do you think she or he should take their first test?
Earliest test for a junior in Algebra 2 is going to be the February ACT and the March SAT. I wouldn't go before that. Make sure you have a good, solid, full semester under your belt. You don't have to wait till the end of the term because we can look. They're not asking the full suite of Algebra 2 questions, and then it's and we can teach that what's required. But I want you to have like a basic foundation, so we aren't teaching you the foundations of Algebra 2 for a test prep company. That's very inefficient. So I would say just wait until February ACT and March SAT.
Great. We really appreciate everybody joining us this evening. I'm going to give you a 2-minute piece of free advice. And that is if your student has not already started test prep. So if they had a wonderful summer, they were really active, but they're waiting to take the PSAT and look at standardized testing this fall, get a plan. Don't let yourself look up at Thanksgiving or, God forbid, Christmas and think, what are we going to do for standardized testing? This is increasingly one of the 3 or 4 more complicated topics for families and students that we work with. And we always say to families, we say to many spring sophomore families, get in front of this, have a plan. It's not a one-size-fits-all plan. It depends on the student, her learning skills, how much time she has, what her college list is. But if there's any piece of advice we would leave you with beyond the fabulous information that Jed provided, please make sure you walk into the first day of school with a plan and make sure that test prep doesn't consume your student's junior year with stress. They can navigate this. They can go through this process and have testing be an indication of their excellence, not their enemy in terms of stress. Thanks so much for spending the time with us on this webinar. Tomorrow, we'll send out the recording and this material, as well as a wonderful guide that Applerouth has. And for the families that we work with, we always say to them, hey, after the PSAT, work with Applerouth to have your student take a practice ACT. It's the easiest, fastest way to get a benchmark of which test is the best. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of the day. Bye now.